Good evening, everybody. Thank you for our Institute on Aging, thank you for being at our Institute on Aging, Age On evening. As you know, Institute on Aging works to enhance the quality of life for aging adults and adults living with disabilities, enabling them to maintain their health, well-being, independence, and participation in the community. And we provide innovative community-based programs that enable our clients to live at home for as long as possible. We serve as an essential partner in the continuum of care by providing health services, social and emotional support, education and advocacy, and a commitment to healthy aging. That's why we do these Age On programs, to remind everybody that creativity and spark can happen at any age, anytime. And tonight we're very fortunate to have two wonderful authors with us, both musicians. I will get started with them and then I'll bow out and I will become a disembodied voice. They will talk for about 30 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up for questions, and I will field the questions to them. If you want to type your questions in the Q&A feature or the chat, I'll pick up those questions there and then pose them at the end. So without further ado, we'll get started. Ellen Harper is a singer, songwriter, musician, teacher, and owner of the world-renowned Folk Music Center in Claremont, California. In 2018, she released her first solo album, Light Has a Light of Its Own. And I want to say, I really love, I think it's the first track on that called The Busker. What a great song. You must listen to this, everybody. Ellen and her son, Ben Harper, whom you may have heard of, collaborated on the album Childhood Home and went on international tour together in 2014. Their musical journey is the subject of a documentary called A House is a Home, directed by Danny Clinch. Ellen received a PhD in education from Claremont Graduate University, and we will call her Dr. Harper because we believe that people who are educators deserve their honorific as well. And she has taught at California State University, San Bernardino. Dr. Harper currently runs the Folk Music Center Shop, concert series, folk festival, and music classes. And you can learn more about her at www.ellenharper.net. And with her tonight in conversation is Sam Baer, an author, musician, and publishing professional. His roles include freelance editor, book doctor, and publishing consultant. He's written a book called How to Play the Harmonica and Other Life Lessons. And he co-authored Write That Book Already, The Tough Love You Need to Get Published Now, with his late wife, Kathy Kamen Goldmark. And now he's co-written Always a Song with Ellen. Always a Song, Singers, Songwriters, Sinners, and Saints, My Story of the Folk Music Revival. And he's also a member of the illustrious literary rock band, the Rock Bottom Remainders. And he also, Sam edited and co-authored Hard Listening, the greatest rock band ever of authors, tells all. So I'm going to stop here. Sam also lives, writes, and plays music in the San Francisco Bay Area. Maybe we'll hear a little bit about that as well. But in the meantime, I'm going to, as I said, make myself a disembodied voice and let the two of these have a wonderful conversation. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Caitlin. Thanks for having us here. And it's great to be here to talk about this book, which I love being a part of, Always a Song. It's a great book. And of course, if I do say so myself, but I really do love it. And I started out being something I was, invited to do as work, but it became really a labor of love, particularly because of this wonderful woman here. And let's get to it, Ellen. What is it that, let's start with, really the genesis, which is what prompted you to write the stories, I'll say it that way, write the stories that we encounter in Always a Song.
I started writing stories actually quite some time ago. I've always been a note taker, jotter down of words and thoughts, but those evolved into stories about the past, about the Folk Music Center. I realized that my grandkids really didn't know anything about the early days of the Folk Music Center or their grandparents' histories. So I started writing stories and sharing them with family and friends who liked them and wanted more stories. And that's the first that Sam basically, when we started, got a handful of stories, although not a handful anymore. It was a computer full of stories. And and liked them and decided, I guess you decided to sign on to the project, right, Sam?
Correct. Because of my background in publishing and as an author, but also because of my background as a musician, a publisher named Mark Tauber, who was at Chronicle Books, who was the publisher of this book, invited me to become a part of the project. And then as I remember, that was the moment when I really met you, because we talked, of course, and I looked at your writing, but then I flew down to where you are right. We might want to explain where you are, because my background's boring. Okay, it's very boring. It's a Venetian blind. But your background is a little more interesting. So perhaps you could tell a little bit about where I met you when I flew down there to Claremont.
Well, the reason I'm here is I live in a canyon, and nature and technology don't always get along, so I don't have a good enough connection. So I'm here at the Folk Music Center, which is one of the starring characters in the book. And I'm in the back of the store, which is a repair shop, complete stringed instrument repair shop. So worth flying down from San Francisco to bring your guitar.
Well worth it. Well, yeah, go ahead.
And so if you can see behind me, there's a balalaika, there's an oud, an electric guitar of all things, and lots of stuff. And
yeah, the store, I want to convey to people, it's just a beautiful store, the Folk Music Center in Claremont that Ellen runs. But the front of the store, of course, is displays of. Well, maybe you could tell a little bit about the front of the store too. The
front of the store is actually two things. One, it's a store, and we sell all acoustic instruments. Occasionally, an electric one slips in, and instruments from all over the world, which was one of the very first. We were one of the very first stores to do that, actually import world instruments, international instruments. And it also houses the museum, the Folk Music Center Museum. So all up and in the upper shelves are rare and unique instruments from everywhere that you can check out if you come in.
And yes, and a moment ago you mentioned that you had started writing these stories as to record them for your family. You mentioned grandchildren. You have 3 sons, and how big is the family now? If you can you count it up?
Well, I have 3 children of my own, and then I ultimately married someone who had 3 kids. So between us, we have 6. And I believe we are now at 15 grandchildren.
All right. That's pretty wonderful. Okay, so there's a lot of people. You're going to have a big audience right there for this book.
Right there, yeah. Although not all of them are
a little young yet. Right? Okay, and then maybe we could talk a little bit. I'm going to guess that maybe some of our audience would be interested in how we did what we did, because it's, writing a book's hard enough. And, writing a book is not an easy task. And then but I would say it benefited us that we worked together. That's my feeling. Maybe you could talk a little bit about how we started to work on it. I mean, you sent me the stories, and really it was a conversation at first, I would say. And then we dug into the writing.
Yeah, it was a conversation. I think I just sent you a bunch of stories,
right, the raw material,
not just sort of vaguely organized stories, and we talked about how to proceed, and we went through through different options. We started in the present and went back to the past, and then came back to the present, and ultimately decided on a chronological story. But a whole bunch of stories is fun, and it's fun to write them, and I hope Sam had fun reading them, but it isn't a memoir. So Sam and our big project was to make these a coherent narrative and turn it into a memoir. So basically I would write chapters, send them to Sam. Sam would look at them, work on them, and either call or email, and we'd connect about where they were going and how they were working. And it was very important to me and very important to Sam to weave the history of the times in. So it starts in the 1950s, and to weave in the political history and the social history, and keep that going throughout the book without it becoming, I mean, I have a PhD, right? And, and I've done a lot of historical research. I didn't want it to become, pedantic or, and so to keep it in a, what would you call that? A
A
voice.
fun story, fun narrative, a narrative, a good, straight narrative. And yeah, actually, I want to talk about one of the interesting things to me, because I flew down and met you in this wonderful folk music center in that beautiful college town of Claremont. And that was, that's who I met. But then as I read it, I discovered that this story doesn't begin in Southern California at all. It begins in kind of the exact, almost the polar opposite of, in a couple of ways, of Claremont in Southern California, in New England. And so perhaps you could, and really sort of the Boston area and also Southern New Hampshire, towns outside of Boston, for those of folks who don't know the geography there. Why, I guess, could you talk about your life in the beginning of the story, which is New England, and what prompted your family to leave New England?
Okay. Well, my paternal grandparents met in the Socialist Party back in the teens, the 19 teens. They married. My grandfather and grandmother ultimately became communists and were very active at that time in the 30s in particular, when communism wasn't necessarily as dirty a word as it is today. Mm-hmm. And his main concern with farmers, small farmers, and he felt that preserving the small farms was very important, that people could be self-sufficient, or at least somewhat. And my grandmother was a midwife and a nurse, and she, in fact, started one of, I think, the first birth control clinic in New Hampshire. So there was a political history. My parents were both political, anti-war, the pacifist movement. And when my father came back from the war, there was a very active political group. But my father was in the party for a brief time in the 30s, and he was part of the penny auctions that saved farmers' farms. The neighbors would get together and pay a penny for this and a penny for that, buy a farm back and give it back to the owner when the banks were foreclosing on everyone. So that was his history. He also became a school teacher after, went back to school after the war, got his degree, taught math and English. And in the 50s, with the McCarthy and Hoover, it caught up to the family. And my grandfather had passed, but my grandmother was put in jail actually for her beliefs. And my father was fired from his teaching job and blacklisted. So we were in Massachusetts at the time, in a small town, shipbuilding town, Weymouth, Massachusetts, near Quincy. And after a few years of the blacklist not letting up, he decided to pick up and he'd move the whole family to Los Angeles. And that's how we arrived here. And
while you were still in New England, your father was not involved particularly with music, but your mother was. Could you say a little something about her musical side?
Yes, very important. My mother had learned to play guitar and banjo from a woman named Bess Lomax Hawes, sister of Alan Lomax, daughter of John Lomax, who are very famous in folk music, folklorists, I guess you'd call them. And she learned to play. She learned very quickly, and she started helping Bess with her classes. And ultimately, when Bess moved to California, my mother took over all of her classes. And in the situation she was in, where she was teaching at a place called Hecht House, she came across many people from that Boston area, and even the New York people who would come up there. Pete Seeger is one, Tony Salatin, and many others. And she became, well, let's see, I lost my thread. So She played the banjo, played the guitar, organized events and for Hecht House, and played music. And actually, it was her doing that got us to California, I guess you'd have to say. Pete Seeger would come up to Hecht House and help with some of her with the big folk music classes, the guitar classes and banjo classes. And she invited him to dinner one evening because my father was sinking into a morass of just trouble, not being able to find work and having a family to support. And Pete came to the house, had dinner, and they got to talking. And Pete suggested that he was already repairing instruments for my mother's students, to go into that as a business where he would be his own boss.
Yeah, that's great. By the way, jumping back to when you said the penny auctions for the farms that your father helped save, I just remember the story, particularly in the book, of he and a few other people maybe taking the sheriff and a deputy had come out to sort of, take the bank side in the situation and stop these uppity farmers from, preventing the proper sale. And that your father, and it sounds like we don't know for sure, but it sounds like your father and a friend or two took them around back and sort of removed their weapons and asked them to leave politely, or maybe not so politely.
Well, I think they gently surrounded them and went behind the barn and suggested that they hand over their.
So this book is Always a Song is Ellen's memoir, but it's really, as all memoirs are, not just one person's story, but the story of a world, really, Ellen, the world that you traveled in and are traveling in. And the characters we're talking about, Charles and Dorothy Chase, are really bigger than life in this book. Charles Chase comes from sort of a highly Republican, highly, just your straight-laced Yankee kind of family, but he becomes, of all things, a communist, which is certainly not what you expect from that background. And Dorothy, or Dot, as I think you really would call her, Dot, was Jewish. So that in itself, by the way, is in some ways at that time an unusual marriage. Am I right about that?
That's right, yes. And in fact, my paternal grandfather had married a Jewish woman also. That's Elba. And so my father did the same thing. He married a Jewish woman. In fact, two or three of his brothers also married Jewish women. And even though they came from what I think Aquila Chase, who landed in Plymouth or River in
we have it in the book. It's like the third ship after the Mayflowers, and really Yankee, way back, Pilgrim background.
Yeah.
Wow. So that's quite so you come out to Southern California in a sense. I mean, I don't know whether you call yourself, I think you would at that time identify as Jewish. You had a mother who was Jewish, right? You were Jewish culturally to some degree. So what was it like for from your point of view, you have no power. You're just a kid. You get dragged all the way across the country to what must have seemed like a foreign land, Los Angeles, California. What was that like for a Jewish girl from New England to land in LA at that time?
Well, we were not a religious family. We were culturally Jewish, like you said. What was it like? It was like moving to a foreign country, really, and also the just adjusting to the weather. For heaven's sake, we arrived in December and spent Christmas Day on the beach, which was a whole different experience.
That's not so bad, right?
It wasn't so bad. Although, as a kid, I wasn't the one that had to scrape the.
I think we momentarily, Ellen is momentarily. Are you there, Ellen?
Hi, Sam, it's Catlin. It looks like maybe she's got a little interruption in her internet.
I imagine they figured that out by now.
Yeah, let's see.
I will tell a story briefly from it.
Well, Ellen gets back online.
Until Ellen gets back on, how Ellen had to, she suddenly, she had a Boston accent, park the car in the garage, and she had to she just shut that down. You know, she just realized she had to change her her way of speaking so that it was no longer New England to fit in. And you know, kids, you know, as we all know, kids want to fit in, and she had to do that right then and there. And while we're waiting for her, should I keep talking, Caitlin, a little bit about
Yeah,
that?
absolutely, Sam.
Okay.
You're a good
So,
representative. Yeah.
I will carry on while we're waiting. And she, so the Charles and Dot, Charles really is struggling. He is a teacher for some of the time out there in LA, but you know, he's just the back. I don't know if I imagine a lot of our listeners are aware of how bad McCarthyism was. To be blacklisted was really to not be able to get work, and maybe even to have to leave the country. There were people who committed suicide because they were blacklisted.
Right.
Charles was a tough cookie. He took Pete Seeger's, the great folk musician Pete Seeger's, idea of and founded the Folk Music Center with his wife Dot, who was the one with the musical connections and music in her heart, and who could sing and play. And that's the founding of the Folk Music Center in Claremont in 1958. When I was down visiting with Ellen, she showed me they went from like a tiny little, like 1/3 of a tiny little building to what it is now, which is an entire large building that, you know, stretches across a block. And they just made a go of it and succeeded. Oh, it looks like maybe Ellen's coming back.
Yeah, okay.
There she is.
Coming back.
I don't see her, but I hear her.
Call in tech support.
All right.
Tech support is handy, especially when it's your grandson. It's great
There
to
you
have.
go. Welcome back. I just told, sort of in brief, the story of starting up the store, and you know, that you started that your parents started it in 1958, and then it went from a tiny little shop, the part of a shop, to what it is today. But so let me jump to your life. So the store has been created, and your parents, sort of, music is everywhere around you, but to you this is normal. Is that right, Ellen? You think, well, this is a normal life, you know?
Yeah. Oh yes, it seemed very normal. It wasn't long though. I was early into my teens when I realized that this is a unique situation, that most people's lives did not look like mine, which meant me going to work every day after school to help my grandfather in the music store, my mother's father, and having musicians staying in my house all the time, and musicians, artists. We had people stay all the time. My mother was producing concerts very early, very soon. As soon as we landed in Claremont, there was such a need for music. My mother started teaching lessons immediately. She would teach in the living room. My father was trying to find and buy up banjos and guitars to fix for people to play. And we had nowhere to sit after a while. You know, we had guitars on the dining room table. We had guitars and banjos on the couch and mandolins everywhere. And they looked at each other, and my mother finally said, you know, if we're gonna have so many instruments, we're gonna have to have a store. I didn't take us seriously, but that's exactly what they did, and they started the store. And just it was just the right time in 1958, and the students, the teaching took off. There was a folk song society. There were concerts. My mother put concerts on. She connected with the Southern California musicians and venues, and we just soon had all kinds of people coming through the house, from Gene Ritchie to Brownie McGee and Sonny Terry and Mike Seeger, the New Lost City Ramblers, and they're always
Doc Watson coming by.
Doc Watson, yeah. And they come to see the store, and they'd stay at the house, and they'd play their concerts. And of all the places, and there were 2 or 3 other places in Southern California that were popular venues, but the word got around what a fabulous cook my mother was. So we usually had them staying overnight at our house. And
so some other Joan Baez and even Joni Mitchell makes a cameo in this book. Lots of, of course, you got the board by Jackson Brown. Jackson's a big supporter of the store, and members of the Byrds came by the store before the Byrds existed. But you are a musician too. So, and it's sort of funny, you kind of went into that sideways a little bit. You were surrounded by music, music was going on everywhere, and you picked up a guitar somewhere along the way.
I did along the way. Well, my mother was teaching lessons in the house. She was teaching kids in the house mostly, and she'd have after school kids would come in and we had a special room in the house, and she'd teach her lessons. And I don't know, at one point I just started picking up a guitar and following along and learning how to play the guitar. And I found that life was better with music than without it. So I just kept going and learning from the people that came through the store and the house, and ruining my parents' record collection by learning songs. And you lift the needle up and down until you wear out the tracks. And the store wasn't the only venue. I mean, you began to go to other. Well, I mean, first of all, your mother ran a coffee house. Your mother and father ran a coffee house that was a home for music, and you went to other venues. And then there were that folk music scene involved these sort of summer camps. I guess it'd be the best way to describe them to people that never been to one. Yeah, I think that's still extant. Well, not during the pandemic, but folk music camps are very popular. Folk musicians like to get together and jam and sing and play and learn, and they apparently have for quite some time. And so there was the Idlewild School of Music in the mountains near here, and then Fresno, there was a place called Sweet's Mill that where a lot of people got started and got known at some of these camps. And that's one of the ways that my mother met people to come through and sing at our place. And for a while, she was using venues around town, school auditoriums and so on. And they were so popular that she and my father and some friends started a place called the Golden Ring Coffee House. And we had quite a lot of people come through there as well.
And you played there as well, right? You warmed up.
I played there.
But then, so you're growing up, and this is now, we're in the 60s, and the folk music revival is just going really strong in the 60s. Then it began to morph a little bit into the rock and roll, folk rock thing. But and you met a man, and you met Leonard Harper, who became your husband. And you, like, apparently now, if I think about it, apparently a family trait. You two had an unusual marriage for that time, in that it was an interracial marriage. Mm-hmm. And Leonard Harper was an African-American man and worked in the university world's college world.
Yeah, he was a university administrator. Mm-hmm.
Right. And you two met, and but that was at a time when that kind of relationship, the world was hostile. A lot of America was hostile to interracial relationships.
Yeah.
Oh. And you were in you were creating a family in an all-white town, Claremont. I should say all-white, but
virtually
very white town, and one that was divided very much in that the Latino, the Mexican American community would be separate from the white community, and you guys must have stuck out honestly like a sore thumb at that time. And what was that like?
What was that like? Well, the government statistics show that at that time, interracial marriage was approved by only 17% of the population, which was substantially up from 1955, which I also checked, where it was only 3% of the population. So but that's still a lot of people that don't really care for what you're doing. We met some pretty difficult situations that we, I like one, for instance, was where Leonard got beaten up at a party, which was tough. And
yeah, so I mean, it's awful.
Yeah, it was awful. And I finally, I actually got on top of him and I said, you got to come through me now. And And I guess they hesitated long enough for people to pull them away, but it,
But you,
huh?
well, you did what you could, and you guys had a tough time, if I remember.
Yeah, we had a tough time,
Finding housing, was not easy.
finding housing, and he was the only Black administrator at the time at the Claremont colleges, and there may have been just a couple of professors, and so he was everybody's, that friend that people talk about. My best friend is African American, so he found himself in that situation quite often. But there were also good times, and we had the 3 kids, and we, stayed strong for a while and did what we could. But
Yeah.
and what brought us the marriage down was not really the color or the racism or any of that. That we dealt with, we could deal with, and it was addiction, and that's another thing.
Yes, Leonard unfortunately has alcoholism. Now. He's an alcoholic, and a fairly severe one, and that is the real struggle you guys go through together. You have 3 young boys, who in terms of that world would be seen as Black boys, not as white, or not even as biracial. Not in those days.
Not so much, yeah.
Yeah, and you're raising them, and Leonard and the relationships becomes untenable for you.
Yeah. Yes.
That must have been hard.
Well, it was hard. I divorced him, and raised the 3 boys were, let's see, 6, 4, and 2 at the time. Yeah. And it's being a single mother's hard.
Well, and you divorced him, if I may say so. You divorced him because he became violent towards you. He really the alcoholism was severe enough that he just turned into another person.
Yeah, he I mean, for the most part, he was what I guess you'd call a functional alcoholic. I mean, he was able to go to work and hold down a job at the time, and but no, he did binge drink, and he did become violent, and I left the marriage with the children, and had to go back to work full time. So I went to work at the Folk Music Center, and that's where my kids came after school. They would come down to the music store and hang out. And just like I grew up in the music store, they grew up in the music store.
That was your anchor. Yeah. And your parents were still around to help you with that.
And my parents were around. Yeah. And my mother, although she did not want the marriage to end for, I don't know, multiple reasons. She was always there to help with the kids, as is my father. And
so you have these 3 sons, Ben, Joel, and Peter, and they've all led really interesting lives, and all have led interesting lives that are in one way or another connected to your folk music center. And you tell some of their story in the book. And Ben Harper, your son, of course, who wrote a foreword to Always a Song, and became is a very famous musician, and as a result of his being a famous musician, and then you and Ben collaborated on an album.
Yeah. Yes, I got a call one day. Well, after as a single mom, I also kept up music. I played in bands pretty steadily, and wrote songs, and put them aside and wrote them, and then Ben, like, his career just took off, and at one point we had said, he had said things like, "Mom, we should do an album together," and yeah, and it just never happened. And then one day I got a call from him, and he said, "Okay, Mom, we've got 10 days to record an album, so meet me at the studio tomorrow at noon." And that was our day one. And we did do an album in just about 10 days, 10 songs. And yes.
And for those of you who don't know, that's fast. But anyhow, that's fast. That's fast
really
work.
Fast. I think it did actually extend a little bit over the 10 days, but Yeah, so that was a very interesting project.
It wasn't, and you also went interesting places, not necessarily, well, related to the album partly. You went to some interesting places related to the album, which people can read about in the book. But you also went, one of my favorite stories is you go with Ben to the White House.
Mhm.
We should identify which White House, because there have been different administrations of late.
You was invited to the Obama White House,
Yeah,
and he had done some stumping for Obama, early on before he was
Ben had done
Ben
some.
had before 2008, and he was invited to the Memphis Soul Show at the White House, and he asked his mother to be his guest, and so that was quite an experience. I did meet the president and first lady, and although you're just passing through a line and
Right.
get a hug and an air kiss and
You spent more time with the great blues harp player Charlie Musselwhite and his wife, as I remember it, probably.
yes, Charlie Musselwhite was there accompanying, yeah.
Yeah.
And they're a great couple, yeah.
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 And so you went to the White House. You also, there's another event you went to. I think I'm trying to remember why you went to Neil Young's place.
Oh, the Bridge School benefit.
Yeah.
Oh, Ben had invited me to do a song with him, and
Right.
yeah. So Neil Young has these fantastic people at the Bridge School benefit. That it's for children with special needs, and the school, and so Paul McCartney.
You sat down with Sir Paul McCartney, and you talked about grandchildren, I think was what you were chatting about, because one of yours was there. Is that right?
It was actually CJ, the tech, the person that got me back up and running.
He's grown.
Yeah, he was a lot younger. I think he was about, I don't know, 5 years old probably, and I introduced him to CJ. This is Paul McCartney, and he's just looking over his shoulder back at the Pong game he had been playing, kind of like, okay, that's he was very polite, but
Paul McCartney, but I want to go play that game.
I gotta play.
Well,
Yeah.
So there are a lot of great stories and always a song. I think we've probably sort of covered the sweep of things. If not, there's a lot more to read. But Caitlin,
Well, I have a few questions that if you would like to take these now, that would be great.
Yeah.
Of course.
One person asks, Kathleen asks, I'm so interested in the collaborative process of writing, and I wonder if Sam might talk about how to reflect Ellen's voice, and if Ellen could address how she responded to what Sam wrote, or was this more of a writing together?
I definitely tried to be conscientious about maintaining Ellen's voice, because this is Ellen's story. My role was to help get it written, but it's Ellen's story, so it's her voice as much as possible. I hope I didn't, I think I helped with that. But I just was always conscious that it's her voice. That's what we're trying to, even as I worked on the text and rewrote sentences, I was thinking, I don't want to write like Sam Barry writes. I want to keep what Ellen has written and do my best to, help her craft it. So, and we kind of did a thing which I borrowed this from my brother Dave Barry is a writer, and he wrote a book with another writer named Ridley Pearson, and they wrote a few books together, and they called it, the siren back there, they called it ping-ponging. And I kind of think we did that a little. We would once we had the text, we would sort of bounce it back and forth between us until we thought it was in good enough shape to move on to a new section. That's my thoughts. Ellen?
Well, first of all, I want to say that collaborating with Sam on this book was a lot of fun, which so writing is hard work, but it also can be really fun.
Yes.
He's a very funny guy, actually, and comes by it naturally. But yeah, it was, I'm telling my story, so nobody really knows how to tell it but me. And I think my voice sort of I tried to reflect the age more or less of where I was at the time when I was writing. But Sam, I guess he would be like what I would like co-writer, co-thinker, editor. He kind of had a lot of, weren't you sort of like an editor?
Yes, I was. I mean, very much in
There's
the
a
sense.
lot edit, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's kind of, I'm going to have to go into too much detail, but there was the whole sort of time, if you think about it, on when we were getting the book together. And then I felt more like we were co-writing,
Yeah.
but you were writing and I was sort of trying to help write it. And then I shifted to much more of an editorial role. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Once we had the story.
And Sam, I tended to write these stories about people that were around me, about people that I saw and knew. And I guess Sam, well, Eva from Chronicle too, but
Yes.
Sam's one, he's like, well, what were you doing at that time? He's like, mostly I was just observing and watching, but that took quite a while for me to actually put myself into the story. And
Right.
it turned out, I think at your suggestion, the thread that threaded the whole thing together was me talking about myself basically in the book.
Yeah.
Do you think?
Yes, absolutely. It really is your voice that ultimately tied, that's how it became a whole piece, a manuscript.
Yeah.
This is a question. This is a question that could be issued to both of you. But as seasoned musicians, older musicians, how do you feel your style and your approach to music, songwriting, and writing has evolved to where you're at now?
Songwriting. Well, I've written songs over my life a lot, but I don't know. I think I finally had something to say in songs, so it seemed like the right time to do it. And after Ben and I did Childhood Home, our duet album, I kind of knew the ropes and the people to go to do my own album. And it just, I guess, it was a perfect storm for me. What about you, Sam?
I just think that the thing I love about music is that it's immediately emotional, and you immediately feel it when you're doing it or listening to it, for that matter. I mean, when I hear other people doing music, and that's how music touches me. It's just right here, right away. It's like in my gut. And performing, of course, it's fun to be a ham. I mean, get to gut up and the extroverted side of me, which isn't my whole being, but it's a lot of me, gets to come out and show off. Musicians are show-offs. Even if they're very geeky, by the way. I don't know if a lot of people understand this. Musicians are geeks. I mean, if you learning how to play a guitar is a geeky thing to do. It's like this weird.
Well, some of us are quite cool, Sam.
I know. So there is. Well, I'm sort of trying to counterbalance that. Everybody thinks that musicians are cool. Well, I don't know if everybody thinks musicians are cool, but
no, we're not. No,
but they're really geeks in a lot of ways, because music is this language you have to learn. And writing, on the other hand, is this very solitary experience. That was one of the joys, by the way, of collaborating, was it wasn't so solitary. When you're writing a book alone, it's just like, oh my God, why am I even doing? It's hard to write a book. You just have to discipline and keep going. But and the joy is much more in the craft of it, which is why rewriting is so much more fun. Would you agree, Ellen, that rewriting is more fun than
we
writing?
absolutely agree. Yeah. Yeah,
So,
the rewriting.
Very different art forms,
Yeah.
because and I think authors, I think that's the reason the Rock Bottom Remainders came to exist is because everybody gets to get up and make a fool of themselves and pretend they're a musician for a while, because writing is such a solitary act.
Yeah. And singing, and just the communal aspect of singing and getting together and parties where everybody brings out an instrument and plays and sings is kind of gets in your blood. There's nothing like it.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with it. And by the way, we're all hurting right now. Musicians are hurting during this pandemic. Everybody's hurting. I'm sorry. I don't mean to sound self-pitying, but not to be able to perform live music is a drag. I'll leave it at that.
That's a big deal. In terms of, I'm hearkening back to the time period that the book covers. The book covers a large swath of time, but some of the social ills that were occurring at that time, we're seeing a replay of some of these today. So would either of you like to speak to that in terms of, gee, as a writer, as a musician, I thought we had put some of this behind us, and now here are some of these issues rearing their heads again. And how do you think you will address those in your own artistic endeavors?
Well, I think that's one of the reasons that weaving history into this story about my family and the music story and music and performing was so important, because you really do need to learn from history, just like the sayings goes. You know, if you don't learn from history, you're doomed to repeat it, and that is what we're doing. And it seems as though we generationally have to keep going through this. I don't know that I have any answers. Sam, do you?
Well, I think in the book, in Always a Song, I think there is you would find hope there. I think because looking back at the 50s, the McCarthy era was really horrific. We forget how bad it was, I think, and maybe the country doesn't want to. The United States doesn't always want to acknowledge our dark side. But on the other hand, there was a lot of hope there. Musicians provided a lot of hope, but just people in general resisting that kind of tyranny. And the 60s were, of course, very difficult time for the whole country, and there was a lot of violence, racial strife. And you know, I don't want to be Pollyannish about it, but we go through it, and we go through it, and we got out the other side. And I would argue have made progress.
I think sorry. One of the reasons we're going through it again is the conventional narrative, what we learn in school, what we hear, what is the American story, hides the history of the Communist Party. It hides the history of underrepresented people. It hides the history of people of color, labor history, working people. And so we don't really know what's happened. We don't really know that certain words were demonized in the 50s. And I mean, the 50s were a very serious lead into what we're facing now, I think. It's like we cut the left wing off of the American eagle, and it flies in circles to the right. And that's brought us to the Trump years, I think. And hopefully maybe we're on the other side a little bit, but yeah, go ahead, Sam.
No, I was fingers crossed.
You know, I have a question
Okay.
that's I have a question that's related to what we're talking about here. You know, someone wonders if, Ellen, you could comment on why folk music matters to our understanding of the United States. Is this an American genre, or do other countries have a version of folk music? And what's unique about folk music in the United States?
In my book, Always a Song, we go into that quite at some length. Sam, I mean, if there's any one thing that we tossed back and forth, I think it is the meaning of folk music, why it matters, what it is. And it's, gosh, folk music has been how people, working people, suffering people have expressed themselves since forever. It's a voice, it's a musical instrument, it's coming together, it's protest, it's churches, it's work songs, and the music brings people to the politics, and I think the politics brings people to the music. So there's that sharing that takes place. Sam, you might have something more articulate to say on this.
No, well, that was very articulate, but I also think that in a sense that what happened at the Folk Music Center has happened to music in general. You know, folk music was fairly, I don't want to be critical of folk music in the 40s and 50s, but it was more narrow in its, I mean, folk musicians really strive to try and find and unearth the music of the people. And that's a wonderful thing. And that's what I think makes this country's music so powerful. But what happened at the store was what was I guess the story in the book would be bringing in sitars would be maybe the best story, but there were a lot of others. But so your store, the Folk Music Center, brings in a sitar, which at the time is this terribly exotic instrument. That's sort of a metaphor right there for what has happened, which is I think sometimes what we call folk music has now been called world music. And that's to the good, I think, because there's folk music everywhere, and it's not just here in the United States, obviously.
I mean,
So, yeah.
well, and American folk music is made up of people from all over the world, because most of us all are immigrants and have brought our music from somewhere else. And it's been, stolen and shape-shifted and shared until it's something uniquely American that has been exported to the rest of the world now.
Yeah, there's a saying among folk musicians that when you're teaching somebody a song and they go, well, we usually do an E minor there, we don't, and people would always go, well, that's the folk process, which which was really an excuse for well, I just learned it by ear and I've changed it, and but that's part of the joy of folk music. And the great folk musician songwriter Woody Guthrie, somebody ran up to him and said, Woody, they've stolen your song, stole your song, and Woody looked at him and said, they steal a song, I steal a song. It's really the kind of freedom to have music not be owned by anyone, but really to travel from musician to musician. And by the way, not just musicians, but people who listen to music too. You wouldn't have music if people didn't want to listen to it. So I appreciate the listeners too.
I think many of us feel that what's exciting about folk music is that, unlike other musical forms, there's probably less ageism. You can age gracefully and exciting and creative ways within the folk tradition. Do you want to speak a little bit about that, either of you, in terms of the longevity of folk musicians as opposed to other forms of music?
Sam, do you got something right off?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that's true, that you're allowed, you don't have to, you can have a crackly voice that's, maybe seen a few years, and folk music actually appreciates wisdom. Ellen, you could actually address it, because you talk about it in the book, about really the struggle, the time when a folk song was defined by being something that was old and found.
That's right.
So it's inherent in a way to folk. Yeah, go ahead.
With that, yeah, well, what folk music is going to be argued forever by ethnomusicologists, I'm sure. But it, for a while in the 50s, it was not cool to write your own songs. You needed to find them, and they were unearthed and discovered. But I think the singer-songwriter movement was it was quite a renaissance in a way, in the 60s, 70s, the music and that came through. I know it was the Vietnam War, I think, was part of it, and folk music coming of age a bit, and the lines being blurred between commercial and traditional, and
yeah, and I think the appreciation, so old and young, I think you're right to say that folk music resists ageism, because a lot of music, it's a good point, really. A lot of music is like, oh, that's what I heard when I was coming of age and as a teenager, and so that's the greatest music that ever happened. And that seems to happen over and over again. Each generation has that, and that's fine. That's pop music, usually. But I think folk music resists that and tries to be the music of that is passed on and is of all ages. And therefore, people appreciate older musicians, but they also appreciate younger musicians. I mean, teaching part of folk music is teaching people to sing, even people who are not musicians, just to get everybody singing, which is one of my favorite things about folk music, is that it keeps everybody in. There's a lot of that spirit in this book of even the professionals who come through, there's still that, desire to include everyone in the process in making music.
And I've noticed that a lot of young people that are taking up folk music are very excited about going back into the archives and finding the old original banjo players and Clarence Ashley and the blues players. And so there's an honoring of age as well that I do see.
That's a very important point, the honoring of age, which is something that we hope continues to evolve in our society. It's been traditional youth-based over the last few years, but I think that's changing again. And that's exciting to see, to hear. I'm going to ask our audience if anybody has any more questions. And while they're thinking, I'll ask the two of you, Sam and Ellen, if you have anything else you'd like to say before we wrap up this evening.
Well, this has been great. It's been an honor, and it's really been fun to be here with Ellen and talk about the book.
Yes. Thank you, Caitlin. It's been fun, and it's been educational for me, learning how to do a Zoom thing.
Well, you know, the truth of it is, Ellen, we're all learning in this brave new world. It's new for us. So we're riding the wave together. I'm not seeing any more questions right now, but I think that's okay. I think that will encourage everybody to go out and buy your book, which just sounds wonderful. And I want to thank you both so much for being with us this evening. I mean, we could probably sit here all night and listen to your stories, but we need to buy that book. And maybe we'll have you come back another time, Ellen and Sam.
Okay, sounds good. I appreciate you inviting us.
Oh, thank you. All right, we will stay in touch. We've got some notes coming in. Thanks for such an interesting hour, says one person. And I would wholeheartedly agree. This was really compelling.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay,
Everybody
you.
be well, and
All
stay
right.
safe.
Okay, yeah.
all right.
Yeah.
Take care.
Bye, Caitlin.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.